There is a bridge off the coast of Islamorada, Florida, that does not go anywhere at all. It runs out into open ocean and then it ends, and it has ended in that same place since a Monday night in 1935. That night, 187 men sheltered from a hurricane on lower Matecumbe Key. When the sun came up the following morning, only 8 of them were still alive. 682 men were building a highway through these islands that summer, and about 260 of them never left. The government did something that week it had never done before, which was to ship original fingerprint records to the site of a disaster. Those files worked, but they only covered the veterans, so every civilian who died that night went into the ledger under the same 2 words. They were listed as unknown dead, and most of them have stayed that way for 90 years. The official investigation was completed within days, and it concluded that the storm was an act of God. It reached that conclusion without ever calling a single witness. To understand why anyone was out there, go back 3 decades to a Standard Oil founder named Henry Flagler, who built a railroad across open water to Key West. Key West was the closest deep-water American port to the new Panama Canal, and the men who built the line worked in brutal heat with scarce food and water. There was nowhere on the islands to house them, so the railroad moored 2-story floating dormitories offshore and let the men sleep out on the water. In October of 1906, a hurricane came through. The line holding 2 of them gave way, and one was carried into the Gulf Stream and pounded until it came apart. 83 men lived through that night. 3 separate hurricanes killed more than 200 workers before the line was finished, and Flagler finished it anyway in January of 1912. The railroad ran for 23 years, and then in 1935, the government sent a different group of men into the same water. They were World War I veterans, and most of them had come out of the bonus army that marched on the Capitol, demanding the compensation they had been promised. In July of 1932, the Army drove those men off the Capitol steps under the command of General Douglas MacArthur. 3 years later, the government put roughly 700 of them into 3 work camps on open beach in the Keys, in wooden shacks a few feet above sea level. Here is the first thing the official investigation left out, and it is the detail that changes the entire story. On the 15th of August, more than 2 weeks before the storm, Washington had already announced that the Veterans Work Program was being terminated and the camps closed. The men were supposed to be gone, but the transfers back to the mainland moved slowly, and hundreds of them were still sitting in those shacks on Labor Day. The storm was found by a civilian, an aviator in Cuba named Leonard Povey, who flew his own plane up and found the Weather Bureau had it plotted in the wrong place. It was not going to Cuba, it was going to the Keys, and the camp officials did not call for an evacuation train until 2 o'clock that afternoon. The train did not leave Miami until 25 minutes past 4. And by then, the men in the camps had already run out of time. The hurricane came ashore at Long Key at roughly 8:30 that night, and the pressure recorded there has never been matched anywhere on land in this hemisphere. The reading was 892 millibars, which is the lowest sea level pressure ever officially measured on land in the Western Hemisphere. The winds were estimated at 185 miles an hour, with gusts past 200, and the surge stood 18 to 20 feet high. What made it lethal was not its size, because an eye wall 6 miles across, moving at 8 miles an hour, does not pass over you, it settles on top of you. The rescue train reached Islamorada at roughly 20 past 8, arriving at the same moment as the surge, which lifted every car except the locomotive off the rails. A 16-year-old named Bernard Russell was sheltering nearby with his family in a lime packing house, and his father, John Russell, was the postmaster at Islamorada. The pressure difference blew the windows out of the building, and Bernard later described his nephew being pulled straight out of his arms and his mother going with him. He never saw either of them again, and by morning, the Russell family, which settled Islamorada in 1850, had lost roughly 50 of its members. The fingerprint files shipped down to identify the dead had nothing at all to match the Russells against, because those records only ever covered the veterans. The families who had lived on these islands for 80 years went into the fires without names on them, and that is where the ledger left them. Over on Windley Key, a camp sergeant named Paul Pugh and about 70 other men spent the storm holding onto a railway water tank car. Pugh said afterward that in France there had at least been something to fight against, and that down there all they could do was hang on and wait. 2 days later, a writer who lived in Key West took his fishing boat up into the Matacumbes to help with the recovery, and his name was Ernest Hemingway. Hemingway had been wounded in the same war these men fought in, and what he found on those islands turned him into the story's investigator. He wrote to his editor that the veterans had been practically murdered, and that the administrators had all of Sunday and all of Monday to move them. On the 17th of September, he published the argument in a magazine called New Masses, under a headline his editors gave it, asking who murdered the vets. The federal inquiry had already reached the opposite conclusion, clearing the camp officials of any wrongdoing and filing the whole thing away as an act of God. 250 veterans were cremated on the banks of Snake Creek, and their ashes were sealed into a crypt at mile marker 82, where they remain today. 42 miles of Flagler's Railroad were destroyed that night, and the line was never rebuilt. But the story does not end there. 3 years later, in 1938, the government finished the highway anyway, and it laid that road directly on top of the old railroad bed. That is the bridge from the beginning of this film, and those piers are what is left of the railroad the highway was built on. The road today runs across 42 bridges with one lane each direction, and it is still the only real way out of the Keys. In 2025, brush fires closed that highway and the Card Sound Road at once, sealing off every vehicle route out of the islands. Florida law now requires the county to clear every permanent resident off those islands within 24 hours, and it cannot meet that number if too many people live there. So the county caps building permits by ordinance, which means this one road legally determines how many people are allowed to live in the Keys. If you are heading down there during hurricane season, there are 3 things worth knowing before you go. The first is to leave on the watch and not the warning, because a watch means 48 hours out, and a warning means 36. The men in those camps had warnings of full day out, and they were still there when the water came. So treat the earlier number as your deadline. The second is that there are only 2 roads off the islands. One fire closed both of them, and after a major storm, nobody returns until all 42 bridges are inspected. The third is the one people forget, which is that on the 18-mile stretch, there is no shoulder and no way around whatever happens in front of you. That road was built by men who were told they would be sent home 2 weeks before the storm, and who were still standing there when it came. And their ashes sit in a crypt at mile marker 82 that you drive past on the way to Key West. The bridge out in the water is the older one, and it belongs to the 200 men who died before them. Both of those roads are underneath the one you are driving on. So the next time you make that drive down to Key West, remember that the road under your tires was paid for twice. American Death Traps takes you down one American road every episode, and there are far more of them than anyone would like to admit. Subscribe, and we will see you on the next one.